Picture this. You're standing in the desert. It's maybe 45 degrees Celsius. There's no shade, there's no water fountain, there's definitely no union rep. And in front of you, thousands of people are dragging a 2.5-ton block of limestone across sand, one grunt at a time, while an overseer somewhere down the line is yelling the ancient Egyptian equivalent of "keep it together, we don't stop for lunch yet." No cranes, no trucks, no electricity, no forklifts, no diesel engines. None of the tools you'd instinctively assume you'd need to move something the size of a small car hundreds of times a day for decades. Just rope, timber, sweat, and an idea so stubborn it would outlive every single person pulling that rope by 4,500 years. So here's the question that's actually worth asking. Not, who built the pyramids? We know who, and we'll get to that. Not, aliens, because we're going to torch that one in about 30 seconds. The real question is, why would any society, anywhere, decide that the single best use of decades of labor, food, and manpower was a giant, silent pile of rock that does nothing? It doesn't grow food. It doesn't defend a border. It doesn't produce a single loaf of bread. By any purely practical measure, it is an enormous waste of resources. And here's the part that should really bother you. It wasn't just Egypt. Let's start with the myths, because you've heard them, and they're wrong in genuinely interesting ways. Myth 1, aliens built them. Cute. Great for a documentary at 2 a.m. with a guy in a leather jacket and suspiciously good hair. But we have the quarries these blocks came from, cut marks and all. We have the ramps, the sledges, the copper chisels, the wooden levers. We have entire workers' villages, Deir el Medina, the Giza worker town, complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical records showing healed bone fractures, meaning these people got hurt, got treated by someone with actual medical knowledge, and went back to work afterward. That's not an alien construction crew with a tractor beam. That's a labor force with a healthcare plan and a payroll. Myth 2. Slaves built them. Also wrong, and honestly a lazier myth than the aliens one, because it requires ignoring actual evidence instead of just inventing new evidence. Archaeological work on the workers' cemeteries near Giza shows skilled laborers, seasonal farmers, and paid crews who were fed a diet that included meat, a genuine luxury in ancient Egypt, reserved for people the state wanted to keep functional, healthy, and loyal. These weren't chained masses being whipped up a ramp. They were, in a very real and slightly bureaucratic sense, employees with rotating shifts, team names, and apparently enough morale to scrawl graffiti on the blocks bragging about which crew worked harder. Myth 3, the one people don't even question, that it happened fast, like some kind of montage. It didn't. The Great Pyramid alone took an estimated 20 years, decades of continuous logistics, tens of thousands of workers cycling in and out with the seasons, and a level of engineering precision that's honestly a little insulting to modern assumptions about primitive ancient labor. Its base is leveled to within a couple of centimeters across a footprint the size of several football fields. Its sides align to true north with an accuracy that some modern buildings don't bother matching. That's not luck. That's decades of trained surveyors solving the same problem over and over until they got it right. So who actually built them? And, more importantly, why did they say yes? Here's the mechanism, and it's smarter than almost anyone gives it credit for. Egypt's entire economy ran on the Nile's flood cycle. For roughly 4 months a year, the field sat underwater, unusable, which meant that for a third of every year, an enormous portion of the population had nothing to farm, nothing to harvest, and no income unless somebody paid them to do something else entirely. That something else was pyramid building. The state looked at a seasonally idle workforce and did something almost unervingly modern. It turned unemployment into infrastructure. Bread and beer as wages, calculated and rationed with real precision. We have the ration records. Purpose-built housing for the crews, with kitchens and sleeping quarters organized by work gang. A rotating labor system, organized by region, so no single village permanently lost its farmers to construction duty and starved the following season. This wasn't slavery. This was one of the earliest large-scale public employment programs in recorded history, and the pyramid was simply the project that justified running it, year after year, reign after reign. But wages alone don't explain why the outcome had to be a pyramid specifically. You could organize seasonal labor around almost anything. Roads, irrigation canals, a genuinely enormous fence. So why? Out of every possible shape available to Bronze Age engineering, a mountain? Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because Egypt wasn't remotely the only civilization that landed on this exact same answer. 4,500 kilometers away, and completely disconnected from Egypt, the Maya were building step pyramids deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica. No contact, no shared trade routes at that point in history, no shared writing system, no shared religion, no shared architects passing notes across an ocean. And yet, the same basic idea. Stack stone into a mountain. Put something sacred on top. Make it visible from as far away as possible. Go further, and the Mesopotamians were doing it too, with the ziggurat, a stepped pyramid built not primarily as a tomb, but as a literal stairway for gods to descend to earth. Its terraces planted with greenery, so it doubled as a symbolic mountain in a flat river landscape that had none. And in Sudan, the Nubian pyramids, over 250 of them, more than Egypt actually has, despite almost nobody putting them on a bucket list, smaller, steeper, sharper angled, built for essentially the same core reason, to mark the resting place of a ruler in the most permanent, unmissable way physically achievable at the time. Cross the Pacific and you get earthen pyramid mounds in places like Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, built by Mississippian peoples with zero contact with Egypt, Mesoamerica, or Mesopotamia. Same impulse, different material, dirt instead of stone, because dirt was what was available. And in China, the early emperors were burying themselves under massive earthen pyramid mounds of their own, the most famous being the tomb complex of the first Qin emperor, guarded by an army of life-sized clay soldiers, sealed under a mound that archaeologists still haven't fully excavated. 5, arguably 6, separate civilizational traditions. Zero communication between most of them. The same architectural conclusion arrived at independently, centuries or millennia apart, on completely different continents, using completely different materials. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns that show up across unconnected cultures usually point to something built into us as a species, not something one culture invented and everyone else politely copied. So let's complicate the tomb theory, because it's just a fancy grave seriously undersells what's actually happening here. A pyramid isn't just where a ruler's body ended up. It was a bureaucratic machine wearing the disguise of architecture. Building one required a taxation system precise enough to feed tens of thousands of workers without the whole operation collapsing into famine. A logistics network to move multi-ton stone blocks from quarries hundreds of kilometers away, on schedule, without modern transport. A calendar system accurate enough to track the flood cycle to the week. And a full hierarchy of overseers, scribes, and engineers reporting up a functioning chain of command, with names, titles, and complaint records that still survive today, including, famously, a note from one crew leader complaining that his team wasn't getting the good beer. In other words, you cannot build a pyramid without accidentally building a state around it. The pyramid wasn't just a monument to a king. It was physical proof that a centralized government could organize tens of thousands of people toward one impossible, decades-long goal. And if a government could pull that off, it could also organize an army, collect taxes reliably, and enforce law across an entire kingdom. The tomb was the stated reason. The state building was the actual, unspoken achievement, and arguably the more important one. Which brings us to the unifying theory, and at this point it's less about ancient Egypt specifically and more about you, sitting there watching this. Humans are status signaling animals. That's not an insult, it's just biology, and it shows up in every human society we've ever studied, on every continent, in every era. Across cultures, across millennia, completely disconnected groups of people have consistently converted surplus resources, food, labor, time, into permanent displays that say, this group, this leader, this civilization mattered and will keep mattering long after every single person here is dead. A pyramid is simply the loudest, most permanent version of that signal available to Bronze Age and Iron Age technology. It can't be stolen the way gold can. It can't rot the way wood or crops can. It can't really be argued with, the way a claim or a story can be disputed generations later. It just sits there for thousands of years, saying, we were here, and we were powerful enough to move mountains for a single grave. That instinct didn't disappear when the last stone was set at Giza. It just changed materials. Look at a modern skyline. Skyscrapers with a single company's name mounted at the top, built taller than practically necessary, purely to be visible from the furthest achievable distance. Corporate headquarters designed less like functional office space and more like architectural statements, all glass and angles, and a lobby nobody actually needs. National monuments built not for any practical use, but specifically to be photographed, remembered, and outlived. Even space programs, if we're being honest with ourselves, are partly about who gets to plant a flag first and get their name permanently written into the history books, the same way a pharaoh's name was carved into a cartouche meant to survive forever. We didn't stop building pyramids. We just stopped calling them that and started calling them headquarters, monuments, and mission patches. So go back to that image. The desert, the heat, thousands of people dragging stone with rope, timber, and sheer stubbornness 4,500 years ago for a wage of bread and beer and the promise of housing during the flood season. They weren't being tricked. They weren't enslaved by aliens with a strange fondness for limestone geometry. They were fed, housed, organized, and convinced, the same way every civilization since has convinced its own people, that some things are worth building even if you personally will never live to see them finished. The pyramid was never really about the afterlife. It was about making absolutely certain nobody could ever forget you were here. And somewhere between Giza, the Yucatan jungle, the banks of the Euphrates, the mounds of Cahokia, and the buried army outside Xi'an, unconnected civilizations looked at the exact same problem. How do you make power permanent when you have no photographs, no internet, no written record guaranteed to survive, and arrived, independently, continents apart, at the exact same pile of rock? That's not a mystery. That's just what we are.